So we're very pleased today to have Richard Smith with us, and thank you, Richard, for agreeing to participate in our project.
Well, thank you for interviewing me.
So we always start out with some background questions for contexts. So I'll
Right.
start in with those, and then we'll get what I like to call the meat of the matter. So I'll start out by asking you, where were your parents born?
Montreal,
Okay. And where were you born?
Montreal.
Okay. And where did you receive your education? Elementary, secondary, and any post-secondary?
Elementary, I did at Carlisle School in town of Mount Royal. Post-secondary, I did at a Catholic high school in Mount Royal called Mount Royal Catholic High School. Then my last 2 years I did at a private school in Montreal West, which no longer exists. It was an English school. Then we left Quebec, and I went to University of Western Ontario. But then I came back and I did a year at Université de Montréal. So that's yes.
Okay. And what is your occupation?
Businessman and here English second language teacher,
Okay. And where do you live now?
Yokohama, Japan.
Very good. Are you coming from us from Yokohama today?
Oh yeah, I'm in Yokohama. It's a little after 10 at night.
Very nice. Okay, well, that's great.
You might be able to tell from the sort of the closet behind me that it has sort of an
Yeah,
Asian
yeah.
flavor.
I visited Asia many times, Japan as well, included in that. So I'm familiar with yeah, I saw the background and it kind of piqued my curiosity there. Okay,
Now,
so
I would just add to that up until COVID, I had been kind of back and forth between the two. I was in Montreal for the summers, and then I'd come back for the winter. My girlfriend's Japanese, and so I was going back and forth. But the COVID has had, up the apple cart. So I've been here since the COVID started. But I'm going back to in September. So that's when I'm
oh,
going
okay.
back.
Well, wonderful. Maybe we can have an opportunity to meet in person.
That would be wonderful.
Okay, so we're going to get to questions concerning your experience living in Quebec. We say today. Well, obviously you're not in Quebec today, but your most recent experiences living in Quebec.
Sure.
So
And
I'll start out by asking you, what is the best thing about living in Quebec?
Well, I would say it's sort of your Euro-American feel. It's really where Europe sort of meets North America. That's sort of its enduring charm. I mean, it's also home because I'm from there and I'm a sixth generation Quebecer. So a lot of history in Montreal and southwestern Quebec. But yeah, I'd say what make the enduring thing would be that you feel like you're in a European city at times with all its charms, the multiculturalism, uh, obviously the beauty of the women, which are renowned. Never underestimate that. So, and yeah, but also with that sort of with the North America, the access to North America, the fact you can grow up and when I meet Americans, they think I'm American because I know all the culture and the English is basically identical.
Yeah. Now, a lot of people have had trouble with the next question. I certainly did when Brian did a dress rehearsal interview with me, and I really had to think about it. But I finally figured out the second question. I'd like you to answer it as posed, but then you can elaborate on your answer as you see fit. Describe your relationship to Quebec in a single word.
Co-orphaned.
Okay.
Now, you probably instantly have a sense of what I just said, although I Googled it and to prepare for this, and it doesn't exist as a word, but co is a prefix, and you know what an orphaned person is. And I know that'll sound strange. Now, in the little article I sent from Ireland, I mentioned that my father passed away when we lived in Montreal when I was 16, in part as a consequence of Bill 101. And it was 1984. We used to have, or right after my dad passed, my mom and I moved to Mississauga, Ontario, where our other family had already gone from Montreal. And it was 1984. She used to have the Gazette sent to her in Mississauga every day. And she showed me an article that Graham Fraser had written in the Montreal Gazette, commenting on how Quebec at that period was being governed by so many men who had lost their fathers as teenagers. Pierre Trudeau, Robert Bourassa, René Lévesque, Claude Ryan. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And it was fascinating. I could send you the article. I managed to retrieve it in the last time I was in Montreal, but I didn't think about it much at the time, other than to notice that it had happened. But later on, when I moved back to Montreal in 1987, the first time, and went to Université Montréal, and then later when I started to write commentary about Quebec politics, and I co-authored a book on the Canadian Constitution where I wrote the chapter on Quebec. And there's three ways I can write in French. One is I could write as an Anglophone with all the particular logic and the experience and the mythology and facts that surround that. Or I've been a long-time conservative federally, about 40 years. So I can write from that perspective. But sometimes I feel like when I write in French, and my publication rate in French is very high, is because I write as sort of a fellow orphan. I often felt that the Québécois are something akin to a abandoned teenager. I think it was only, and when they came to that critical point in their history in the 1960s, it's kind of it's interesting that the process would be led by orphans, and what the French call orphan. I used to receive a little orphan's pension from Quebec until I finished university, and all you had to have is one parent missing, because then often in English we assume that both parents are gone, and I find that's been incredibly helpful and helped me connect and make a wide network of friends throughout the political spectrum in Quebec, from sovereigntists to federalists and whatnot. Because I always fall back on that when I'm sitting at my screen and the cursor's just beeping and where am I going to go? I think how does that feel? Now I'm Irish citizen, in addition to being Canadian, because one of my grandfathers was born in Ireland. And that's why the article talks about that. The Irish too, in many ways, have a parallel experience to Quebec, but in other ways they're different, because they were more of, you could say, like a formed society at the time of their conquest. So, but Quebec was very much a society that was in the stage of becoming something. So that's where the two narratives differentiate. So that's kind of my feeling. And I find when I talk like that a little bit with Francophones, they seem to have a lot of sympathy. Whereas ironically, Anglophones seem to be more at a loss to understand that. They understand the personal episode, obviously, but only now in Quebec Anglo history is there a feeling of abandonment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's why I would come back to that word.
Okay. And where do you feel most at home when you're in Quebec? For example, in communities based on language, culture, profession, or geographic location?
I'd say geography. Again, I grew up in Montreal, but when I finished Université Montréal, my French was still kind of an intermediate level. So I thought, well, probably best to try to start my career, and I started in sales, which my father had worked in, someplace where I could still mostly work in English, because it might just be impossible to work completely in French. So I moved to the Ottawa area, and or I should say over to the Outaouais, as they called it at that time. So I lived in the Outaouais and I worked in Ottawa, and I found that whole experience fascinating. I mean, we used to have a house north of Montreal in a place called Bevan Lake near Weir, Quebec,
Mm-hmm.
and that also was sort of a family homestead. So the Gatineau Hills are very reminiscent of that area, and the other thing that I thought was really fascinating is, Montreal, I mean, it's so big that the English section is quite large. So it's easy to live your life within that realm, right? But in the Outaouais, it's all compressed. So I was sort of socially, I was running more into Francophones than I ever had in Montreal. I was speaking more French than I ever had in Montreal. And, I had French girlfriends and the whole thing, but I could still work in English in Ontario. So I never had to worry about anything to do with Quebec interrupting my professional life as it had my father's. So in a sense, I made a correction. So I still feel when the chips are down that the Outaouais is a safe place, because I can just resume my career in Ontario, but live in Quebec.
Okay, fair enough. Now, the next question, a lot of people, they don't have difficulty with it, but I get a lot of questions about it. So it's a two-part question. The first part is fairly straightforward. It's the second part people have asked me about. They said, well, the official definition, according to who? And my response is, and the question is meant to meant to evoke, is your perception of the official definition. It could be based on the Quebec government, the federal government, or neither, the media, your peers. So having said that, hoping that that clarifies what we're looking for, I'll ask the two-part question. How would you define a Quebecer? And do you think the official definition in Quebec includes you?
Okay. Uh, I'd say if we're referring to the word Quebecer, which is
Or
English,
Quebecois? Yeah.
okay. I would enter a new word into the lexicon, which I've used in publications in French. Richard Smith est un Québécois. So, so you remember in 2006 when the House of Commons was looking at the question of is Quebec a nation. I wrote to Stephen Harper about it because I had briefed him on Quebec. I had been invited to brief him on Quebec politics in the 1990s. So I wrote his office, I got a response, and I told him that that issue of is Quebec a nation would continue to persist because he had been in Quebec City previous to that resolution and had been asked on Saint Jean-Baptiste Day if he felt the Quebecois were a nation. And he had responded that he thought it was a semantic question. And that's when I wrote him saying, I think you got to look at that a little differently. And basically what he did is what, and I'm not going to take credit for it, but it was basically what I wrote. And his office did send me a response and acknowledged that the relationship. But but at the top, one thing that was not, I thought was very interesting is he put the word Quebecois into the English version of the law.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now up until that point, that had not been the case. I mean, even José Legault, of course, is that famous nationalist commentator, would still, explain how Quebecers feel about this and that, with the implicit idea that it's Francophone, or maybe including us. But all of a sudden, I thought, well, that's wonderful. That frees up the English version of the word, and so I no longer have to use the hyphen. Even so, and often the hyphenated Anglo-Quebecois is a little misleading in my case, as I'm virtually completely 100% Celt. I mean, even through Zoom, you can probably see I got, as Neil Cameron, my old boss, used to say, I have the face of Ireland, the map of Ireland all over my face. So I would put out there that just say, I'm a Quebecer, period. And to me, that means someone who identifies with English in Quebec. Now, you could further subdivide that into two categories. What you could call a status Quebecer, similar to a status Indian, means I have the right to send my children to schools in Quebec in English because I was educated in English in Quebec. And then those folks who aren't a status Quebecer because they don't have that criteria, so they're in some other category.
Yeah.
But I just thought, I mean, I got sick of the hyphens. I'm sure a lot of people do. I just say, hell, shill, I'm a Quebecer. Pure de dire, je suis un Quebecer. Yeah.
Okay. Has your sense of identity as a Quebecer changed over the years? And if so, in what ways?
I'd say, again, on that sort of personal journey, I had a kind of an empathy for French Canada as a sort of orphan society that I may not have had if I hadn't have had those personal circumstances. I mean, as a younger man, I could be arguably, before my father passed, probably very insensitive and probably had a terrible sense of, the Quebecois should vote this way. And then, of course, they do something else. I had a terrible sense of what they would do under certain circumstances. That all changed. So now I often find I have a real feeling for what they're going to do and some of the contradictions in the discourse within French-speaking Quebec. Often it's more of a challenge to understand my own community, which of course is not very homogeneous, right? So I feel a pride in it. I mean, I have outside my door, I have the Canadian and Quebec flag. And in the late 1990s, funnily enough, there was a contest somewhere in the United States trying to judge the prettiest flag in North America, regional flag, and the Quebec flag won.
Mm-hmm.
And I stood back and I had to really separate myself because everyone was projecting all these things into it and not really seeing it for what it was. And I say, maybe I'm just being unfair. Let's just look at it again and say, yeah, it is a pretty flag. And if we want to see it as, of course, there's a cross in it and there's French symbolism. And if I want to go down that route, I can. But I can also turn around and say, hey, what the hell? It's a pretty flag, and as an adult, I mean, I consciously made an effort to spend more time learning French. Like when I was in the Outaouais, I joined a sports club that I knew where I'd be speaking French. I had French girlfriends from different parts of the province. I traveled most of Quebec. I've been all over. And I must say, I like French Canadians. I mean, there's some of my cousins are Francophones. I mean, the Irish are quite intermarried. I still think the best weapon in their defense of their language and culture is their good nature when it's allowed to shine. And that could bridge in. Now that could bridge into this question of nationality. Is Quebec a nation and whatnot? And I'd advised Stephen Harper in my letter that I thought the Quebecois were a nation, but Quebec was a province of Canada. And but that said, I mean, families can be constructed through two means. One is you can be born into one, genetic, or one is somebody goes down on bended knee and proposes to someone else that they create one. So maybe one day, if we really feel that a sincere invitation is coming to us to be a part of it, maybe one day we'll even say we feel that we're a part of a nation. So I'd say maybe one day I'll feel that. I'm not excluding it. I don't feel it now. But maybe one day I will, and that'll be a good thing.
Okay. Now, what are some of the most difficult things from your perspective about living in Quebec?
Well, especially when I was younger, and I created I mentioned that was mentioned in the article, is I helped create a group that's been recreated. Actually, we're just going to be putting up our website soon. I went through the English school system and graduated in 1981, but really I wasn't functional in French, and neither was anyone else really who graduated with me. So, I mean, there's nothing. Essentially, I think the English institutions attempted to make us bilingual. I don't think it was intentional, but we could speak French to a certain extent, but we were not, and this is key, we were not competitively bilingual. And by virtue of being sort of segregated off into English schools, we had no networks that could be helpful. So the English school system is, without intending to be, has been an agent of the diaspora of Quebec Anglophones. And I know people blame the legislation, and obviously I have my issues with the Bill 101 and all the rest of it, but some of the changes that caused that emigration were changes in the marketplace. I mean, Montreal had a larger Francophone population. The marketplace required more bilingualism, irrespective of the law. So whether the law insisted on unilingualism or bilingualism, most Anglophones just didn't have the skills to exist in either dynamic, and so simply left. So I think professionally it was a big thing. As I mentioned, I didn't feel, even after my year at Université of Montréal, I certainly had made progress, but I didn't feel competitively bilingual, so I went to Ottawa. I mean, our little group in the late 1990s were advocating an examination of whether separate schools were really in the best interest of the community. Could perhaps some kind of integrated or combined learning format could work, because both communities needed each other's language. I mean, Francophones for international reasons and continental reasons, and Anglophones for domestic reasons. And we had a lot of encouragement on the Francophone side for that. I was very impressed how much of the media were really interested in that. There were some people who were afraid of it, who called it cheval trojan. If you put English kids in a French school, everybody will speak English. But yeah, that would be the number one, is there's an employment problem. A lot of people like to say it's an inhospitable atmosphere, but a lot of them really, even to this day, they still can't compete in a bilingual workplace.
Okay, now The next question is a little contentious, but I'm going to ask it. I
Oh, yeah,
ask
but
everyone. In recent years, some members of Quebec's Francophone majority have identified a number of linguistic and cultural, I shouldn't call it threats, probably challenges would be a better word. Which of these concerns do you share and support? And which of these concerns make you feel excluded or targeted?
well, and I've had some success with some kind of important Francophone nationalists talking about this topic. People of note. My argument was I think obviously, let alone being the only official language, I think it's a legitimate aspiration for French to become a common language. I mean, when I was a kid, I mean, I think everybody assumed that English was the umbrella language. And I mean, a lot of you'd meet a Francophone and they'd almost always switch to English, or if you even tried in French, they'd switch to English. Even today, that happens a lot, even with people from the Parti Québécois on occasion. So, and I think as opposed to trying to repress French, I just think a lot of Anglophones had an honest misperception of what was acceptable. And when the argument came that, no, we think French should also be an umbrella language, well, that makes sense. I mean, that's fair. The problem is in pursuit of that policy, I find that the nationalists have often, or Francophone activists, are really attacking the symptoms and not the problems. And one of the underlying symptoms, again, comes back to this kind of segregation between the communities, which may have made sense at one time, but don't really make sense anymore. To the having separate everything. And if you look, as you know, the Anglophones in the interior of Quebec have a very different experience than we do in Montreal, because there's just often they have to share institutions. I know my ancestors, I mean, the Francophones who've married into my family met my Irish ancestors in church and out in Huntington, Quebec. And in those days, you didn't have the economy, you didn't have the critical mass to have separate English and French churches, right? I mean, it was just a single church. Now, in those days, everything was done in Latin. I mean, maybe that offers a solution. Maybe the Quebec government should be operating in Latin, and then everybody has to learn the language equally. The burden is equally shared. But but I mean, they had an opportunity to meet each other. But as I mentioned, I mean, I had more opportunity to meet Francophones, befriend Francophones, have Francophone girlfriends in the Outaouais than I did in Montreal. And so I understand their aspiration to make, and I think they're right. If they're not village and French could disappear, I think there's no question about that. And we've all seen Francophones who effectively sort of assimilate into English culture. My stepfather was an assimilated Francophone in Ontario, but they keep focusing on the symptoms. And I keep saying, look, all the regulation in the world is, if you don't change that underlying reality, you're probably not going to make progress. And you're going to alienate all these other people in the process. These Anglophones are going to be alienated. Plus, you're probably not going to get to the goal you want. The English-speaking Quebec is not only not a threat, it is a necessary ally in the defense of French. Because think of us as a friendly lagoon, connected to the wider ocean, but within the island, a place where Quebecois can safely launch craft into North America or internationally. And a good friend of mine, Alain Breton, who I first met, funnily enough, in Japan, now, and he and his Japanese wife live in Quebec City. And he's encouraged me to move to Quebec City several times, saying, look, there's so many companies who need someone who speaks English to do sales. As long as you're happy to speak French in the office, and of course, if everyone goes out for drinks, that you're happy to speak French, which of course I am, then it'd be perfect. So we are not the problem. We are the solution. Just as sometimes these antiviral drugs have to, in fact, use part of the virus in the antidote. We are a part of that, I suspect.
Now, the next question, I'm again borrowing from Guy Rogers. He used this
Yeah,
very effectively as a visual tool in his documentary. Of course, the link I will send
yeah.
you. It's a show of fingers. So on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being weakest, 10 being strongest,
Mm.
indicate how strongly you feel that the joys of living in Quebec outweigh the challenges.
Yeah, I'd say 8 on 10,
Did I
but
see that
dropping. I think
visually?
that's dropping. Yeah. So,
Perfect.
but of course it's dropping. I mean, one of my more recent problems is my Japanese girlfriend wants to come back with me to with Japan. We've been together for 13 years. Um, and we met with Alain and his wife in Quebec City. And of course, they were, his wife was happy another Japanese woman would be in Quebec. And if Alain was happy, I'd be there. We get along so well. Um, and Yuko was very keen on it. And then one day I was watching the news on the computer, and over my shoulder, she could see the Lachute Hospital where the English sign had been taken out, but you could still see where it had been.
Mm.
And she overheard the story why it was necessary to take the English signs out. And she looked at me and, you are nuts. You want to take me back there? And she had a reaction that would make Keith Henderson blush, for God's sakes. I mean, so the compromise again became the Outaouais, because she said, well, I could, then I could build a life in that area, but obviously people in Ottawa are not going to be affected by Quebec politics. So
Okay, good. Now, is there anything else that you would like to say about your sense of identity or belonging in Quebec?
uh yeah, no, I have a strong attachment. I mean, a lot of people think it's really strange that usually there, and I'll say this, a lot of prominent nationalists I've met through my writings and networking and whatnot. Um, I'll give you an example. I guess the first one I ever met was of significance was Pierre-Marc Johnson,
Mhm.
the PQ leader, who could possibly be a cousin of mine, according to my grandfather. Um, my grandfather was the head of the United Irish Society in Montreal. No, the Federation of Catholic Charities. That's it. He was the head of the Federation of Catholic Charities in the 1960s. And he was the Grand Marshal in the parade the year I was in the St. Pat's parade. So, as playing that kind of role in the Irish community, he had occasion to meet Daniel Johnson Sr. on several occasions. And Daniel Johnson Sr. was a very charming man and was of Irish descent. And now my grandfather couldn't speak French, but in Daniel Johnson, in those days it wasn't really so topical. So Daniel Johnson's English was excellent. So they spoke and they got along. So Daniel Johnson Sr. said, I'm, discovered the common cousin. So every time after that, when he'd see my grandfather, he'd say, there's my cousin, how are you? Now, it may not be true, but it could be, because there was so much intermarriage between the Irish and the French Canadians. So, but coming back to Johnson, when I left Montreal, after my dad died, my mom was a housewife, so there was no income issue there. And everybody, my father had just died, and on April 3rd, 1981, and the Parti Québécois was reelected on April 13th, 10 days later. And virtually, we were trying to figure out what to do and should we stay. And my mother was hesitating because her life had been in Montreal, and now we were going to go some new city. And I remember everybody in my life said I should go. Our bishop, our priest, all my teachers. I'm talking about a spectrum of opinion, some people being cynical or maybe intolerant by nature, other people coming from more liberal professions that had more empathy for French Canada and its struggle for survival. It was a consensus. You and your mother should leave. And that was a terrible thing. But then when I decided to come back as a young adult, I approached Pierre-Marc Johnson, and he was very gracious and allowed me to go visit him in his offices in Place Ville Marie when he was the opposition leader. and I started talking to him about various topics in the English speaking community, and he was very good. But the thing that really struck him was, you've come back. So many nationals couldn't believe you come back. So many of them think, that I write all these articles from Japan, and then other times when I had a job in Toronto, I worked in Toronto, wrote from there. It's odd. I think they think that we're really just an extension of the old head office culture of Montreal. And we claim to be attached to Quebec because hopefully that'll give us some reprieve on the language laws. But boy, once they're gone, because really, it was really a very what do you call it, symbiotic relationship. It was not a real relationship. And then when someone from all the way over here makes such an effort, and during the recent round of meetings in the English community on Bill 96 and whatnot, I attended the vast majority of them on Zoom. Thank God for Zoom, really. and and I'm not alone. I mean, I'm still in touch with ex-Quebecers that would, under certain circumstances, would be happy to live there. But I don't know. Given the current turn of events, maybe they wouldn't. But people miss it, so why not?
Okay, well, that concludes the official portion of this. I'm going to turn off the recording now, but I'd like
Okay.
to continue the discussion because you brought up some points that are very interesting. I'd like to discuss off camera.
Sure.
Stop this now.